The Royal Guards of the United Kingdom are perhaps one of the most well-known symbols of discipline and respect. Everyone knows them dressed in their iconic red uniforms, with tall, black bearskin hats, standing completely still in front of Buckingham Palace. These guards, with their stiff posture and unmoving faces, seem to be immune to the world around them. Nothing, it seems, can break their concentration or their composure. They are the face of royal stability, their job clear and serious, to protect the monarchy at all costs. Their duty is more than just standing still. It is a daily ritual, part of the royal tradition that goes back centuries. The Royal Guards are responsible for ensuring that no harm comes to the Queen and her family. They stand guard at all times, day and night, and are expected to be ready for anything, whether it's an intruder trying to breach the palace grounds or a moment where the royal family needs their protection. It's a job that requires both physical endurance and emotional control. Each guard undergoes years of training. They are put through a rigorous process to ensure that they are mentally and physically strong enough for the task. The training is strict and demanding, involving a mix of physical fitness, military tactics, and the ability to keep calm under pressure. The guards learn to hold their post for hours, without moving a muscle. Even the slightest twitch of an eyebrow, a shift in weight, or a blink could be seen as a failure. Their ability to stay motionless in the public eye is almost legendary. Their training also includes learning how to handle the crowds of tourists who visit Buckingham Palace every day. These tourists are often fascinated by the sight of the royal guards, and they'll try anything to get a reaction out of them. Some will try to make the guards smile. Others will wave in their faces, and some will even shout their names to see if they'll flinch. The guards are taught to ignore all of this. They cannot show a single sign of distraction. They must remain focused and continue their duties without reacting. There's an old saying that a royal guard must remain like a statue. And indeed, that's how they are seen. The idea of a guard moving, even slightly, is almost unimaginable. They are supposed to embody the strength and dignity of the monarchy itself. The public sees them as symbols of unwavering loyalty, and in many ways, they are. These men and women don't just wear uniforms, they wear history. The red jackets, black hats, and shiny boots have been a part of British tradition for generations. The Queen herself, who has lived through so many changes in the world, has a special relationship with these guards. She has seen them grow and evolve over the years, from the time of her early reign to the present day. To her, they are more than just soldiers in uniform. She knows their dedication. She sees the sacrifices they make, and she respects the work they do to protect her and her family. There is a sense of mutual respect that exists between the Queen and her guards. She knows how hard their job is and how much pressure they are under. The Queen understands that the guards are not just fulfilling a duty. They are part of the very fabric of the monarchy. But despite their stoic appearance and their reputation for being unmoving, the royal guards are human, just like everyone else. They have lives, emotions, and stories of their own. They are not robots, and the incredible demands of their job sometimes leave them feeling exhausted. It's not easy to stand still for hours, especially when faced with a growing crowd of curious onlookers. But they do it because that's what's expected of them. Every day, the guards are stationed in various parts of Buckingham Palace, keeping watch over the Queen's residence. There are two main types of guards: the sentries and the ceremonial guards. The sentries are stationed at the palace gates, while the ceremonial guards are responsible for protecting the Queen herself. The ceremonial guards often march in elaborate processions, playing their instruments and adding to the pageantry of the monarchy. Both groups, however, share the same unshakable commitment to their duty. One of the most iconic moments in a guard's day is when they take part in the changing of the guard ceremony. This ceremony, which takes place every day at Buckingham Palace, is a grand spectacle that attracts thousands of tourists. The guards march in perfect formation, with their heavy boots stamping the ground in unison. It's a moment that symbolizes not only the transfer of responsibility, but also the strength and stability of the royal institution. The changing of the guard ceremony is not just for show, it's a crucial part of maintaining security at the palace. It's when the old guards hand over their duties to the new guards. This transfer is done with great precision and pride, ensuring that the Queen and the royal family are always well protected. Yet, despite all the pageantry and tradition, the guards are still human. The world may expect them to be perfect, but there are moments when even the most disciplined individuals show their true emotions. This is what makes their role so fascinating. They are not invincible. They are not immune to the world around them. The guards, like everyone else, experience moments of stress, exhaustion, and even joy. This brings us to a moment that would change everything for the royal guards. It was a day like any other. A regular shift in the life of a guard. The sun shone brightly over Buckingham Palace, and the tourists were out in full force, snapping pictures and trying to get a glimpse of the Queen's residence. The guards stood at attention, their posture as perfect as ever. The air was thick with expectation. It was just another day in the life of the royal guard. However, something unexpected was about to happen. It wasn't a dangerous situation, nor was it something that could threaten the security of the palace. But it was an event that would shake the guards, the Queen, and the people watching. It was a moment that would challenge everything the guards had been trained to do. As the Queen walked past one of the guards, something shifted. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but a small one. It was as if, for just a brief second, the guard's composure faltered. A tiny smile crept across his face, or perhaps his posture shifted slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but to anyone who was paying attention, it was clear. The guard, for just a split second, broke character. The Queen, who had always maintained an air of grace and calm, noticed the moment. She gave the guard a brief, knowing look, a look that said she understood. There was no anger or disappointment in her gaze. Instead, there was something more human, an understanding, perhaps even a little amusement, at seeing one of her most loyal protectors show a small moment of humanity. It was a moment that would be remembered by those who witnessed it. It was a fleeting event, but it revealed something important. The guards, despite their unwavering dedication, were not invincible. They, too, had their moments of human connection. They were more than just statues. They were individuals with feelings, and sometimes those feelings could peek through the polished armor of their uniforms. The Royal Guard had always been seen as a symbol of perfection and discipline. But in that one small moment, it became clear that even the most disciplined individuals can have moments of imperfection. And perhaps that's what made the Royal Guards, and the Queen herself, even more remarkable. Despite the pressure, despite the expectations, they were still able to show their humanity when it mattered most. It was an ordinary morning at Buckingham Palace, or at least it seemed like it would be. The sun had just started to peek through the clouds, casting a warm golden light over the palace grounds. The usual hustle and bustle of tourists, excited to catch a glimpse of the Queen's residence, filled the air. They stood at the gates, eager to snap pictures of the grand palace, and many had gathered to witness the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. The royal guards were already in their positions, standing tall and motionless as always, their bright red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats a striking contrast against the morning sky. The sound of footsteps echoed across the cobblestone paths, and the guards stood at attention, eyes focused straight ahead, undistracted by the crowds. The tourists were thrilled to see them, many pointing and taking photos. But the guards stood like statues, showing no sign of acknowledgement or even a glance in their direction. For them, there was only one focused duty. On this particular day, however, something was different. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a subtle change in the air. The Queen, as she often did, was planning a small gathering inside the palace. The event was private, meant for family and close friends, but it was one that would be significant for those who had the privilege to be there. The guests were invited to celebrate a personal milestone with the Queen, one that was dear to her heart. While the royal guards had no direct part in the event, they were always aware of the Queen's movements and were tasked with ensuring her safety, even during such intimate moments. As the Queen walked through the palace grounds to join her guests, she passed by the guards who stood silently, ever watchful. For the royal guards, this was a common part of the day. But today, there was something different about the way the events unfolded. The Queen's steps were measured and graceful as she walked past the sentries, her eyes gliding over them briefly. The moment seemed to freeze in time, as if all eyes in the area were trained on the Queen's every move, and the guards stood without a flinch. But in that instant, something unusual happened. One of the guards, usually so perfectly still and disciplined, caught the Queen's eye. It wasn't the kind of look one might expect from a military man on duty. It wasn't a salute, nor a formal gesture of respect. Instead, it was a simple, almost imperceptible shift in expression. A fleeting moment when his face softened, and for just a second, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. It was so quick, so subtle, that anyone else might have missed it. But it was enough to break the near-perfect formality the royal guards were known for. Perhaps it was the Queen's presence, her calm and kind demeanor. Or maybe it was just the quiet atmosphere that made this moment feel different. The guard, who had spent hours standing completely still in the face of so many distractions, found himself breaking character. It wasn't a large gesture. It wasn't a laugh or a loud reaction. It was something much more human. Something that showed that even the most disciplined individuals can experience small, personal moments of connection with others. For the guard, it was likely nothing more than a passing thought or a fleeting feeling of relief. After all, standing motionless for hours on end could be exhausting. The guards had to maintain a high level of concentration, tuning out the noise of the crowd, the heat of the day, and the discomfort of standing still. It wasn't a job for the faint-hearted. The guard's shift, as long as it was, required his absolute attention and focus. But in that one moment, with the Queen walking by and the world momentarily quieting, his mind drifted, and he found himself showing a small expression of warmth. The Queen, ever aware of those around her, noticed the brief shift in the guard's composure. She gave a small nod of understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that she, too, recognized the small crack in the guard's usually unyielding demeanor. It wasn't a reprimand or a look of disapproval. Instead, it was a quiet, knowing glance that seemed to say, "I see you." It was the kind of look a leader might give to a trusted companion, offering reassurance and understanding in a moment where everything else remained still. To the outside world, this moment might have gone unnoticed. To the tourists, the other guards, and the staff around them, it was just another part of the day. But to the guard himself, it was something special. It was a reminder that even the strictest duties could have moments of humanity behind them, and that he was seen not just as a soldier, but as a person. And it was a reminder to the Queen as well, that the people who protect her, who stand by her, are not mere statues. They are individuals who give a great deal of themselves to their roles. The guards were trained to be stoic, to keep their emotions in check, and to appear as unyielding as the very palace they protected. But that didn't mean they didn't feel or experience emotions like anyone else. It was a small reminder that even the most dedicated and disciplined individuals have moments where they can express themselves, even if just for an instant. As the Queen continued her path through the palace grounds, the moment faded. The guard, realizing that he had slipped, quickly regained his composure. Returning to his perfectly still position, the smile vanished, his face returning to its neutral expression. He stood tall again, his posture immaculate. The tourists, who had been watching the ceremony and the Queen's procession, were oblivious to the subtle exchange that had just occurred. But for the Queen, and for the guard, it was a moment of connection. The Queen had long understood the weight of the roles her guards played in her life. She knew how hard they worked, how much dedication they put into their duties. And for the guard, it was a reminder that the Queen saw him, not just as a soldier in her service, but as a human being. It was a fleeting moment, but one that would stay with him, a small reminder of the bond that existed between the Queen and her guards. It wasn't a dramatic event. It wasn't something that would make headlines or be remembered for centuries. But for the people involved, it was a small but significant moment of humanity. A brief break in the armor, so to speak, that showed that even the royal guards, so often seen as stoic and emotionless, had their moments of softness. And perhaps, in the long run, that was what made them even more remarkable. The Queen's presence was calming, her understanding of those around her clear. She never sought to make a spectacle of the event. In fact, it was the quiet nature of the moment that made it so special. There was no grand gesture, no visible sign of emotion. It was just a moment between two people who shared a silent understanding. It was a moment that showed that no matter how strict their roles, the guards, like the Queen herself, were human beings with emotions, capable of a small break in character when the right circumstances presented themselves. The moment that had just passed between the royal guard and the Queen, though subtle and unnoticed by most, would not go unremarked. Though no one spoke about it at that exact moment, it didn't escape the eyes of the other palace staff. For those who were nearby, it was a rare glimpse into a side of the royal guards that they hardly ever saw, the human side. The guards, who had always been seen as unflappable and completely serious, had just shown a flicker of emotion. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was enough to raise a few eyebrows among those who witnessed it. As the Queen made her way inside the palace, her mind was calm, focused on the private event she was about to attend. But she was also aware of what had just happened. It wasn't as though the guard had done anything wrong. Far from it. He had simply broken the rigid formality that defined his role. For just a moment. But to the Queen, it wasn't a cause for concern. Rather, it made her appreciate the dedication and the human element that lay beneath the uniform. She knew her guards were trained to maintain absolute control, but that didn't mean they weren't allowed to show their humanity every now and then. Still, the world outside the palace had no idea what had occurred. To the public, the royal guards were perfect. They were symbols of unshakable duty, standing in place for hours, their stoic faces unmoving no matter what happened around them. So, when the news reached the press about the small, unintentional break in character, it became a topic of interest. The headlines quickly spread across tabloids and news outlets, with stories speculating on what might have caused the guard to break. This wasn't something that happened often, and the press was always on the lookout for anything out of the ordinary, particularly when it came to the royal family. The reports, though not malicious, started to paint a picture of the royal guard's supposed imperfection. Some outlets described it as a humorous moment, a rare instance of a guard breaking character, and showing a softer, more relatable side. Others, however, questioned whether this moment reflected poorly on the guard's training and professionalism. It didn't help that the incident had occurred in the presence of the Queen herself. Was it a moment of distraction? Was it a lapse in focus? Was it something that might indicate a bigger problem within the ranks? The stories quickly spread, with everyone offering their opinions on what had really happened. Some viewers found it amusing, even heartwarming. They saw it as a reminder that the royal guards, who appeared so serious, were still human beings with feelings and moments of vulnerability. They appreciated the idea that the guards weren't immune to showing a small glimmer of emotion, especially in the company of someone as beloved as the Queen. But there was another side to the story that began to emerge, especially from critics of the royal family. Some people saw the break in character as a breach of the decorum expected from those entrusted with the protection of the monarchy. The incident, although small, became a source of debate. Was it appropriate for a royal guard to show any sign of emotion in the presence of the Queen? Did this small moment undermine the sense of discipline that the royal guards were supposed to represent? In the eyes of some, the guards' brief lapse in professionalism was seen as a reflection of something deeper. Perhaps the guards were not as disciplined as they seemed. Perhaps they were feeling the pressure of their high-profile roles more than anyone had realized. The royal family was often viewed as a symbol of stability, and the royal guards were an extension of that image. Seeing one of them break character felt like a crack in that otherwise perfect facade. Inside the palace, things were calmer. The Queen had made a note of the moment, but she had no intention of making it a big deal. She was used to the idea that her guards were under constant scrutiny, and she understood the pressures they faced daily. The Queen knew better than anyone that the life of a royal guard was not easy. It wasn't just about standing still or looking impressive in front of crowds. It was about making sure that nothing went wrong while carrying out their duties. They were always under the public's watchful eyes, always expected to be perfect, even when they were exhausted or human. Still, there had to be some sort of internal discussion about what had happened. The senior officers in charge of the guards were likely to have had a quiet conversation about the small incident, especially since it had made its way into the media. Would the guard face any consequences for the moment of distraction? Or would this simply be brushed aside as something unimportant, a moment that didn't require action? It was a delicate balance. On one hand, the royal guards had to maintain their professional image. But on the other hand, they were people, too. And sometimes people made small mistakes or experienced fleeting moments of emotion. The officer in charge of the guard would undoubtedly have spoken to the soldier in question, just to make sure that there was no further cause for concern. It was highly unlikely that any harsh punishment would come from the incident. But there was still a need to remind the guards of the importance of maintaining their composure at all times, particularly in front of the public. After all, it wasn't just the Queen's safety that the guards had to worry about. They were also the public face of the monarchy. The way they behaved, the way they carried themselves, mattered. Every gesture, every look, every movement was carefully observed. But what was most interesting in the aftermath was the way that the incident reflected the true relationship between the royal guards and the Queen. The Queen, who had seen the royal guards through many stages of her reign, had always maintained a level of understanding and empathy for them. She knew that their job wasn't easy. She recognized that, though they were there to protect her, they were also subject to the same pressures and emotions that anyone else experienced. The Queen had seen much in her long life. She had witnessed the rise and fall of political figures, the changes in the world's landscapes, and the pressures of being a leader. Through it all, she had remained calm and composed, and yet, she understood that the royal guards were not so different from anyone else. They were asked to be perfect every day, to maintain a standard that few could understand. As for the guard who had broken character, it's likely that he too felt a sense of humility in the face of the Queen. It wasn't just about the lapse in professionalism. It was the recognition that the Queen had noticed. It wasn't a reprimand, but it was a subtle acknowledgement that even the Queen understood the pressures the guards faced. The fact that the Queen wasn't upset by the moment was a testament to the relationship she had with her guards. It was one of respect, of mutual understanding, and of trust. The public, of course, would continue to debate the incident. Some would find it charming, others would find it unprofessional, and some might even see it as a sign that the royal guards were human, after all. But for those inside the palace walls, the Queen's understanding would likely serve as the final word. She knew what mattered most wasn't a momentary lapse in formality. It was the dedication, the loyalty, and the humanity that existed behind the uniform. And that, in the end, was what truly defined the royal guards. As the news of the incident between the royal guard and the Queen spread, the media frenzy only grew. The tabloids had a field day, publishing headline after headline about the momentary lapse in the guards' stoic behavior. What had started as a small, almost unnoticed event inside the palace had quickly turned into a topic of public debate. For some, it was a light-hearted story, a charming moment that reminded everyone that even the most disciplined soldiers could show a bit of humanity. But for others, it was more complicated. The public reaction was divided. Some people laughed at the incident, seeing it as a rare glimpse behind the rigid facade of the royal guards. To them, it was refreshing to know that these guards, who often appeared so serious and unapproachable, had a softer side. They were used to seeing the royal guards standing perfectly still, their faces a mask of professionalism. But here, for just a brief second, they had seen something different. A tiny crack in the armor, a small break in the character. It felt almost like a reminder that, even in the most serious and disciplined roles, there were moments of imperfection. One particularly popular news outlet wrote about it in a humorous tone, calling the guards' lapse a smile too many, and making light of the situation. Even the royal guards can't keep their stiff faces all the time, they said. For many, the story was nothing more than an amusing anecdote. A small misstep in the life of a man who had stood guard for hours on end. It was a moment of human connection, one that seemed to capture the essence of the guard's job in a different light. One where the pressure of standing still, always alert and focused, could lead to the occasional lapse in formality. For others, however, the story sparked a more serious conversation about the standards expected of the royal guards. They had long been viewed as symbols of discipline, responsibility, and unyielding professionalism. This tiny mistake, seen as a break in the guard's character, led some to question whether this reflected poorly on the royal family. Had the royal guards become too relaxed? Was this a sign that the pressure of their role had become too much for them? The media coverage soon took a more critical tone. Articles began to ask whether the guards' actions showed that the royal guards were no longer as focused as they should be. They questioned whether the guard had been distracted, unprofessional, or even tired. It was a far cry from the usual portrayal of the guards as almost perfect in their behavior. The focus shifted from the fact that it was a small, harmless moment to the larger implications it might have for the reputation of the royal family. The more critical media outlets painted the incident as a sign that the royal guards were not immune to the pressures of their high-profile role. They were humans, after all. And standing still, for long hours, in front of the public, under constant scrutiny, was an incredibly difficult job. But some journalists argued that the public expected more from the guards, especially those entrusted with protecting the monarchy. The incident, however minor, was now the subject of a heated debate. Would this be seen as an embarrassing mistake for the royal family, or would it be shrugged off as just a harmless moment? Despite the differing opinions, one thing was clear. The royal guards had just become the center of attention, and with that attention came a wave of extra pressure, both from the public and from within the palace itself. The senior officers responsible for the royal guards were undoubtedly concerned about how this might affect the public image of the monarchy. While the Queen had been understanding and calm about the situation, it was clear that the royal guards would need to address the incident internally. The officers held a quiet meeting behind closed doors to discuss the situation. They knew that the public expected nothing less than perfection from their royal guards. The tiny break in character, though brief and seemingly insignificant, had caught the eye of many, and it was their responsibility to make sure it didn't happen again. But the officers also recognized something important. The pressure on the guards, particularly those who stood at Buckingham Palace, was immense. These men and women were not only responsible for the security of the Queen and the royal family, but they were also constantly in the public eye. They were expected to maintain an air of perfection in everything they did. Standing still for hours, while tourists surrounded them, snapped pictures, and shouted at them to try and get a reaction, was no easy task. These were soldiers who had dedicated their lives to serving the monarchy, but even they were not immune to human moments of distraction or vulnerability. What made the situation even more complex was the fact that the royal guards, despite being highly trained and incredibly disciplined, were under constant pressure. The weight of their duty could be heavy. And though they were meant to remain stoic and emotionless, they were not robots. They were people. They felt the same fatigue, the same stress, and the same emotional highs and lows as anyone else. As the media continued to report on the incident, the pressure on the royal guard grew. There were discussions about how the guards should be trained to avoid even the slightest lapse in character. Should the training focus even more on discipline? Would a stricter regimen ensure that nothing like this happened again? But there were also voices inside the palace who cautioned against pushing too hard. They worried that by emphasizing perfection to such an extent, it might create more stress for the guards. Instead of making them more effective, it might lead to burnout or even resentment. The Queen, aware of the growing media storm, quietly reassured the royal guards. She was never one for making public statements about such matters. Her demeanor was always calm, collected, and understanding. The Queen's support for her guards had always been strong, and in this case, she knew that a small slip in formality didn't undermine the integrity of the royal guard as a whole. The guards had proven their dedication time and time again. One brief moment didn't define them. The Queen knew better than anyone that there were many layers to the men and women who served her. Their unwavering loyalty to the monarchy was clear, and their commitment to their duty was beyond reproach. But they were also people who faced immense pressure, who had their own lives outside the palace, and who, on occasion, might have moments where their emotions or humanity briefly peeked through. For the royal guards, the media frenzy was uncomfortable, but it wasn't unexpected. They were used to public scrutiny. They had been the subject of jokes and admiration for years. Still, the spotlight on them now felt different. It wasn't just about their uniform or their discipline anymore. It was about their humanity. And in many ways, this shift was what made the entire incident so memorable. As the dust settled, the focus began to shift. The media, after their initial excitement, started to move on to other stories. The royal guard would continue their duties, standing at attention, their faces once again set in stone, unflinching and unyielding. But in the back of their minds, they knew that their small moment of imperfection had been noticed. It wasn't just about maintaining their composure anymore. It was about remembering that, in a world that expected perfection, their true strength came from their dedication and their ability to serve with pride, no matter the pressure. As the days passed following the small but highly publicized moment between the royal guard and the Queen, life at Buckingham Palace began to return to normal. The media, after all the headlines and debates, slowly moved on to other stories, as the public's interest in the incident began to fade. But for the royal guards, the moment had left an impression. Though the Queen had not made a big deal of it, inside the palace walls, the incident was still a topic of conversation among the palace staff, the senior officers, and, of course, the guards themselves. The senior officers, understanding the pressure that had been placed on the guard who had briefly broken character, decided to handle the matter with care. They had no intention of making the situation worse. There was no need for harsh punishment or reprimands. After all, it had been a very small moment, a slip that had been noticed only by a few. But they knew that they had to address it to ensure that the rest of the guards remained focused and aware of the expectations placed upon them. They also knew that the royal guard's reputation was important, and any small mistake could be blown out of proportion. A meeting was held behind closed doors, where the officers discussed what had happened and how they would approach the situation. The officer in charge of the guard, who had smiled briefly, explained that there had been no malice behind it, just a brief moment of human connection. They agreed that it wasn't an incident that required punishment, but rather one that could serve as an opportunity for reflection. It was important for the guards to remember why they were there and what their duty meant, but it was also important for them to recognize that they were people with feelings, not just soldiers in uniform. The guard who had smiled, let's call him Private Smith, was not called out in front of his peers. Instead, the officers quietly pulled him aside and asked if he was doing well. They expressed their understanding of the pressures he faced. Standing motionless for hours on end could be exhausting. It was a tough job, and sometimes it felt like the eyes of the world were on them every single minute of their shift. They reminded Smith that it was okay to have human moments, but that he should always try to be mindful of his actions. It wasn't about perfection, but about maintaining professionalism, especially in front of the Queen. Smith, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders, expressed his gratitude for the understanding shown by his superiors. He wasn't looking for sympathy, but he had been feeling the pressure of his role in a way he had never truly admitted before. The hours of standing still, the crowds of tourists trying to provoke a reaction, the heat of the sun in summer, and the cold of winter, all of it added up. Though he had been trained to keep his emotions in check, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief when the Queen walked by. Her calm, reassuring presence was something that brought a sense of comfort to him. It was in that fleeting moment, that brief connection with the Queen, that he had allowed himself to break the stoic exterior that he had built so carefully. Meanwhile, word of the incident had quietly spread among the other guards. They, too, had been watching the media coverage, reading the reports, and listening to the whispers. Some of them found the whole thing amusing, while others were a little uneasy. The royal guards prided themselves on their discipline, and the idea that one of their own had been so human, so imperfect, was a bit unsettling. But the conversation among the guards soon shifted from criticism to understanding. They began to talk more openly about the pressures they faced in their roles, the emotional toll of the job, and the unspoken bond that they shared. Many of the guards admitted that standing at attention for hours, barely moving a muscle, could sometimes feel like a battle with their own bodies. The fatigue was real. The need to remain perfectly still, even when everything inside them screamed to move, was exhausting. They also admitted that it wasn't just the physical strain that weighed on them. It was the constant scrutiny from the public, the hundreds of tourists watching them every single day, the expectation to always be perfect. They were never allowed to show weakness, never allowed to make a mistake. The slightest shift in posture or a quick glance at a passing bird could result in a moment of judgment, and those judgments were often magnified by the public eye. For many of the guards, the discussion that followed the incident was eye-opening. It gave them a chance to reflect on the emotional side of their job, something they had long kept locked away. It was a reminder that they, too, were human, even though they were expected to act like machines on the job. They understood their role as protectors of the monarchy, but they also needed to acknowledge that they weren't invincible. They were allowed to be human, and there was no shame in that. The Queen herself, though not directly involved in the conversations that took place after the incident, had a quiet influence on the atmosphere around the palace. Her grace and understanding were felt by everyone who worked with her, and her approach to the situation had set the tone for how the royal guards were treated afterward. Her calmness had shown them that it was okay to have imperfections, and that their worth wasn't defined by a single moment. What mattered was their dedication to their duty and the respect they had for each other. In the end, the incident became a turning point for the royal guards. It wasn't something that would be remembered as a scandal or a failure, but rather as a reminder of the human side of their job. They learned that it was possible to uphold the standards of professionalism while still embracing their humanity. The small moment between the guard and the Queen became a symbol of the understanding that existed between the two. An unspoken bond that was based on mutual respect and empathy. For Smith, the experience was a valuable lesson in resilience. He understood the importance of his role, but he also realized that he didn't have to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. His duty was important, but it didn't define him as a person. And for the other guards, the incident had sparked a much-needed conversation about the emotional toll their work took on them. They understood that it was okay to acknowledge their feelings, to talk about the challenges they faced, and to support each other in ways they hadn't before. As the weeks passed, the royal guards continued their duties, standing firm and resolute, but with a new understanding of the balance between duty and humanity. They were still the same disciplined soldiers, but now, there was a deeper appreciation for the personal side of their work. They had learned that being perfect didn't mean being emotionless, and that it was okay to have moments where they showed their true selves. They remained the protectors of the monarchy, but they were also allowed to be people. And as for the Queen, she continued to move gracefully through the halls of Buckingham Palace, her calm presence a reminder that even in the most challenging times, there was room for understanding, for compassion, and for the occasional smile.